There was an evening when I stood in the middle of a lavish banquet hall, the chandeliers shining directly on my face, and listened to the richest man in the city mock me in front of hundreds of guests, while my son stood less than 3 steps away and said not a word. I had raised him on meals I had skipped. I had built his future with my cracked hands, and that night he stood there watching me being insulted, and then turned away. If you want to know what happened next, please like and comment the name of the city you're viewing, so I know how far my story has come. I want to start by telling you something that took me a long time to admit out loud. I gave that boy everything I had, every single thing. And for a long time, I thought that was enough. I thought love, real, bone-deep, sleepless love, would be the kind of thing that held, the kind of thing that didn't crumble just because someone handed my son a better offer. I was wrong. But let me start at the beginning, because you can't understand what happened in that ballroom without understanding where we came from first. My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 63 years old, and I've been tired for most of my adult life. Not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep fixes. The deep kind. The kind that settles into your joints and stays there. A permanent reminder of every year you spent running on empty. I raised Brandon alone. That's the first thing you need to know. His father, a man I won't waste many words on, left when Brandon was 4 years old, packed a bag on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work, left a note on the kitchen table that said he needed to find himself. And that was the last I saw of him, just like that. 4 years of marriage, and he walked out like he was leaving a job he'd gotten bored of. I remember coming home that evening. Brandon was sitting on the linoleum floor eating crackers from a sleeve because his father hadn't made him dinner. He looked up at me with those big brown eyes and said, "Daddy gone?" I sat down on that floor next to him, didn't even take off my coat. And I said, "It's just us now, baby, but we're going to be okay." I meant it when I said it. I just didn't know what it was going to cost me to make it true. We lived in a small apartment on the east side of Millhaven for the first 7 years after his father left. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom with a shower head that dripped no matter how tight you turned the handle. The neighbors above us had a dog that barked every night between 2 and 4 in the morning. The building super took 3 weeks to fix anything. In winter, the heating unit in the hallway rattled like something was dying inside it. I worked at Grayfield Medical Center as a billing specialist during the day. Evenings, 3 nights a week, I took on cleaning shifts at an office building 2 miles from our apartment. A place called Harton and Associates, some kind of law firm, 12 floors of carpet and glass, and people who left their coffee cups wherever they felt like it. I pushed a cart through those empty offices for 4 hours a night, emptying wastebaskets and wiping counters, and I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that every night. I skipped lunches to save money. I wore the same 3 pairs of shoes for 5 years, rotating them so they'd wear evenly. When my coat got a tear in the lining the second winter, I sewed it closed myself with a needle and thread I bought from a dollar store. Brandon never went without, not without dinner, not without school supplies, not without a birthday cake, but I went without plenty. And I want to be honest with you, I didn't do it with grace all the time. There were evenings I sat in the kitchen after he went to sleep and cried into a dish towel because I was so tired I couldn't think straight. There were mornings I stared at the bathroom mirror and couldn't recognize myself. I was 31 years old and I looked 45, and I knew it. And it scared me. But then Brandon would come around the corner with his backpack hanging half off his shoulder, asking if I'd signed his permission slip, and something in me would just reset, like a timer. He was my reason. Simple as that. Brandon was a smart kid, not in a flashy way, not the type who raised his hand constantly or wanted everyone to notice, but he paid attention. He absorbed things. His 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Calloway, called me in for a conference, and I went in terrified that something was wrong. And she looked at me and said, "Mrs. Harper, your son is one of the most observant children I've ever taught. Whatever you're doing at home, keep doing it." I drove home from that conference and pulled over on Elm Street and cried for about 10 minutes. Good tears that time. I pushed him hard. Maybe too hard, looking back. Though I'm not sure I'd have done it differently. I made him do his homework before anything else. I made him read every summer. I took him to the public library on Saturday mornings and let him pick out whatever he wanted, no limits, Because books were free, and I believed with everything in me that they were his way out, our way out. He played baseball for 2 years in middle school. I made every game I could, even when my shift ended at 9 and the game was at 7 and I had to leave work early and make up the time later. I sat on those metal bleachers with my work badge still clipped to my collar sometimes, clapping for him, and he'd look up and find my face in the stands and give me this little nod. Just a nod. But I held on to those nods like they were something precious. When he was 16, he started talking about college, about business school, about wanting to run a company someday. "What kind of company?" I asked him. He shrugged the way teenagers shrug, like the details were someone else's problem. "I don't know. Something that matters, something that makes real money." I told him he could do it. I believed that completely. I just didn't know what real money would eventually mean to him. He got a partial scholarship to Weston University. Not a full ride, but enough to make it possible if we were careful. I took out a small parent loan to cover the gap and picked up a few extra shifts to handle his housing costs the first year. We talked on the phone twice a week. He called me every Sunday, almost without fail, and told me about his classes, his professors, a roommate named Derek, who apparently ate nothing but instant noodles and spoke to no one before noon. He was happy. I could hear it in his voice, and it made all those evening cleaning shifts worth it, in a way I can't fully explain. Junior year, something shifted. He started talking less about classes and more about connections, about networking, about a professor who'd introduced him to some business contacts, about events he was attending, people he was meeting. The Sunday calls got shorter, then every other Sunday. Then I was the one calling more often than not. I told myself it was normal. He was growing up, making his world bigger. That was the whole point. I told myself that right up until he called me one Sunday evening in April of his senior year and said, "Mom, I met someone. Her name is Cassandra. I think this is serious." "That's wonderful," I said. And I meant it. Her family is kind of a big deal," he said, with something careful in his voice. "Her father is Victor Whitmore." I didn't know the name then. I didn't have any reason to. "Is he a good man?" I asked. There was a pause that I didn't understand at the time. "He's very successful," Brandon said. I met Cassandra the following Thanksgiving. Brandon brought her to my apartment. We'd moved to a better place by then, a 2-bedroom in the Clarendon complex, nothing fancy but clean and mine. And she was polite. Pretty girl, very composed, the kind of composed that comes from never having had to be anything else. She looked at my apartment the way people sometimes look at things that make them quietly grateful for what they have. She said thank you when I handed her a plate of food. She said my stuffing was interesting. She didn't ask me anything about myself. Brandon spent most of that dinner talking to her rather than to me. Not rudely, not obviously, but I noticed it. The way you notice a draft, not all at once, just a slow chill settling in. They got engaged 8 months later. I found out by phone. Brandon called and told me in the tone of someone reporting a business decision that had already been finalized. There was no, "I wanted to ask you first," or "I wanted you to be part of this." Just, "Cassandra and I are getting married." I said, "Brandon, are you happy?" "Yes," he said. "Very." "Then I'm happy," I said. I was, and I was afraid. And I didn't know yet that those two things were just the beginning. The Whitmore family had money in the way that some families have furniture. It had just always been there, and they didn't think about it much, and they couldn't really imagine a room without it. Victor Whitmore had built his empire in commercial real estate and development. His company, Whitmore Capital Group, was the kind of name that appeared on building plaques and charity galas and the business section of the local paper. He was 67, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the specific confidence of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered. I met him for the first time at the engagement dinner, a restaurant called Aldridge's, the kind of place that doesn't put prices on the menu. I wore my best dress, the navy one I'd bought on clearance 3 years earlier, and saved for occasions I wasn't sure would ever come. I arrived a few minutes early because I'd been raised to think that being on time was a form of respect. Victor arrived 12 minutes late, and nobody commented on it. He shook my hand with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent years shaking hands with people he didn't especially care about. "Evelyn," he said, using my name the first time like it was something he was trying out. "Brandon's told me about you." "Good things, I hope," I said. "Of course." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that meant very little. We sat through a three-course dinner and Victor talked, almost entirely to Brandon, about the company's next development project, about a golf trip he was planning to Scotland, about a contact he'd made in Brussels. Cassandra listened to her father the way people listen to music they've heard 1,000 times but still enjoy. Brandon leaned forward, absorbing every word with a focus I hadn't seen from him in years. Not since those Saturday mornings at the library, when he'd get hold of a book that actually grabbed him. I sat there and ate my food and asked polite questions when there was an opening, and mostly there wasn't, and by the end of the evening I understood something I hadn't wanted to. Victor Whitmore was becoming, in my son's mind, the father he'd never had. And I could either make peace with that or spend the next chapter of my life fighting something I couldn't win. I decided to make peace with it. I thought that was the mature thing to do, said. The wedding was in June at the Whitmore estate outside the city. Manicured grounds, a white tent that could have housed a small neighborhood, a string quartet playing during the cocktail hour. Flowers I couldn't name that must have cost more than my monthly rent. I was seated at a table toward the back with some of Cassandra's extended relatives and a couple of Brandon's college friends. Not at the head table, not near it. When I mentioned it gently to Brandon the week before, I said, "I just want to make sure I'm somewhere I can see you clearly." He said, "Mom, seating arrangements are complicated. Cassandra's handling all of it." And the conversation moved on. I wore the navy dress again. I smiled in every photograph I was included in. After the ceremony, when Brandon and Cassandra made their rounds among the guests, he hugged me briefly, said, "Thanks for coming, Mom," and moved on to the next table. Thanks for coming. Like I was a vendor. Like I was someone he'd sent an invitation to as a formality. I drove home alone that night and didn't sleep until almost dawn, and the thought that kept running through my mind was, he said thanks for coming. Not thanks for everything. Not I love you. Not I'm glad you're here. Thanks for coming. I pressed my hand flat against my sternum in the dark and breathed slowly and told myself it was just the excitement of the day. Nerves, the busyness of a wedding. I told myself that. So, the first year of their marriage, Brandon and I spoke maybe once a month. He was busy, genuinely busy, I knew that, working longer hours now that Victor had brought him into the company in a mid-level management role. He moved into the Whitmore family's gated neighborhood. He got a new car. He and Cassandra took trips to places I'd never been and would probably never go. I sent cards, birthday cards, holiday cards, just thinking of you cards. Some of them I know got through because he'd mentioned them briefly in passing. Others I'm not sure about. I stopped asking to come visit. Not because I didn't want to, but because the invitations were never extended, and there's only so many times you can push at a door before you understand it isn't going to open. My friend Ruth Ann, a woman I'd known since Brandon was in grade school, someone who knew us both, sat across from me at the kitchen table one afternoon and said it plainly, the way she always did, because she didn't believe in dancing around things. "Evelyn, your son is disappearing into that family. You know that, right?" "He's building his life," I said. That's one way to put it. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. Another way is that he's trading in his history for a better-looking future. I told her she was being dramatic. She gave me the look she always gave me when I was lying to myself, and she said, "Maybe. I hope I am." She wasn't. 14 months after the wedding, Brandon called me on a Wednesday evening. I remember because I was making soup. Nothing fancy. Just a simple vegetable broth I'd gotten into the habit of making in the fall, and I almost didn't answer because my hands were wet. But I saw his name and I picked up. "Mom," he said, and already something in his voice was off, clipped, the way people sound when they've been steeling themselves for a conversation. "I need to talk to you about something." "Okay," I said, and I turned off the burner and stood still in my kitchen. "There's a dinner next month. Victor's hosting it. Big event. Some of his business partners and investors are coming, plus family. It's kind of a formal thing." I waited. I don't think you should come, he said. The words landed like something physical. I actually put one hand on the counter to steady myself. Okay, I said carefully. Can I ask why? There was a pause. Then, it's a specific kind of crowd. People who've known the Whitmores for years. Important people. And I just think it might be uncomfortable for you. The environment. Uncomfortable for me. I turned that sentence over in my mind. You mean uncomfortable for you, I said. Quietly. I didn't say it with anger, just truth. Mom? Brandon, I raised you. I worked double shifts for years to make sure you had everything. I went without so you didn't have to. And now you're telling me I'm not the right kind of person to sit in a room with your father-in-law's business partners. That's not... He stopped. Started again. Victor thinks it's better to keep things contained, to keep the focus on the business relationships. Victor thinks, I said. He's trying to build something, Mom, and I'm part of that now. I have to think about how things look. Something cold moved through me. How things look, I repeated, and I am something that doesn't look right. I didn't say that. You didn't have to, Brandon. There was a long silence. Then he said, in a tone so careful it hurt to hear it, I think it's just better this way. For everyone. For everyone, I said, one last time. And then I said, okay, because there was nothing else to say, because I understood suddenly and completely that he had already made this decision before he called me, and this wasn't a conversation. It was a notification. I'll call you soon, he said. I promise. He called 6 weeks later. I counted. Husham. After that, I started paying closer attention, looking at what had actually changed and when. And here's what I saw, looking back with clear eyes. The Sunday calls had stopped. The cards I sent stopped getting mentioned. When I asked carefully about family events, Thanksgiving with the Whitmores, Christmas at the estate, Cassandra's birthday dinner, Brandon always had a version of the same answer. It wasn't the right time. It was going to be a small thing. It would be easier next year. He'd explain later. There was never a later that arrived the way he described it. I asked him once, directly. I had to gather myself for 3 days before I was ready to say it. I asked him, do you ever tell them about where you came from? About what we went through? He was quiet for a moment. Then, that was a long time ago. That was your life, Brandon. That was my life. People move forward, Mom. I'm not asking you to move backward. I'm asking if you're ashamed of me. He said, of course not. He said it quickly. And quickly was the problem. Sham. The breaking point came on a Saturday in November, about 2 years after the wedding. I had driven 40 minutes to the Whitmore estate because Brandon had specifically told me that this particular Saturday was a casual family gathering. Small, he said. Just immediate family. He thought I should come. I should have known something was off when I arrived, and there were cars lined up along the drive that I didn't recognize. I parked and walked up to the front door feeling the particular discomfort of arriving somewhere you're not entirely sure you're wanted, which was a feeling I had started to know well. The housekeeper let me in, and I stood in the marble entry hall and heard voices, a lot of voices, coming from the main room. Brandon came around the corner and stopped when he saw me. Something flickered across his face, something I recognized and hated recognizing, relief that I was already inside, where the awkwardness of turning me away at the door was no longer an option. Mom, you made it. He said it like someone completing a task. You invited me, I said. Right, yeah, come on in. He touched my elbow and steered me forward, and as I came through the arched doorway into the main room, I understood what kind of gathering this actually was. There were at least 30 people, maybe more, expensively dressed, cocktails in hand, the kind of effortless socializing that comes from having spent your whole life surrounded by people who look like you. Victor Whitmore was holding court near the fireplace, and he saw me the same moment I saw him. His expression didn't change, but something in it settled into something deliberate, something decided. He crossed the room toward us. Evelyn, he said. The same tone he always used, measured, polite on the surface, like politeness was a tool you kept in your pocket for specific uses. "Victor," I said. "Glad you could join us." He glanced at Brandon. "I didn't realize you'd extended the invitation." "I mentioned it to her a few weeks ago," Brandon said, and his voice had gone flat in the way it got when he was navigating between two things he didn't want to choose between. Victor looked at me for a moment, just a moment, and I saw it clearly. I was a problem he was deciding how to manage. "Well," he said, with a smile that was assembled rather than felt, "the more the merrier." He moved back toward his guests. Brandon led me to the edges of the room, toward a small seating area near the window, away from the center of things, and I sat down and watched the party happen around me like I was watching it through glass. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody came over. A few people glanced at me with the brief, polite blankness of people who have determined that someone is not relevant to them and moved on. I sat there for an hour and a half. Brandon circulated. He laughed at Victor's stories. He stood at Victor's elbow like someone learning to occupy space correctly. He looked happy. Genuinely, visibly happy in a way that made something ache in my chest because I could see that the happiness had nothing to do with me being in the room. At some point, I stood up and went to find the bathroom, just to have somewhere to go, and I passed two women I didn't know talking quietly near the hallway. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was just there. But one of them said something and the other one laughed, and I heard the word housekeeper, and I understood, without any doubt, that they were talking about me. I stood in the bathroom for a few minutes and looked at myself in the mirror above the Whitmore's marble sink, and I made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not one I announced to anyone or made into a scene. Just a quiet, interior decision. The kind you make when you finally stop pretending that things are going to improve on their own. I was going to stop asking to be let in. Because if a door only opens from one side, standing on the outside and knocking is not patience. It's just punishment you're giving yourself. I came back out, found Brandon near the drinks table, and said quietly, "I'm going to head home." He looked surprised. "Already? You just got here." "I've been here almost 2 hours, Brandon." He processed that. Then he said, "I'll walk you out." And he did. And we stood on the front step in the November cold, and he looked at me with something on his face that I could read but that he didn't say out loud. "I'll call you this week," he said. "Okay," I said. I walked to my car, and I didn't look back. And the drive home was very quiet and very long, and I thought about my apartment and my routine and Ruth Ann and the soup I'd been making when he called me 14 months ago. And I thought about the little boy who had looked up at me from the kitchen floor eating crackers when his father left. And I thought, that boy would not have let me stand at the edge of a party for 2 hours and said nothing. That boy was gone. I wasn't sure when it had happened, but he was gone. The weeks that followed were the quietest stretch of my adult life. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind that sits in the corners of rooms and in the space between waking up and getting up. I went to work. I came home. I cooked. I called Ruth Ann on Thursday evenings. I read in the evenings. I'd always been a reader, and books had always been where I went when the world got too much to look at directly. Brandon called twice in December. Both calls were short. He asked if I was doing okay. I said yes. He said he'd been busy. I said I understood. He said he'd try to get together in the new year. He didn't ask how I was really doing. I didn't tell him. New Year's came and went. I watched the ball drop on television alone in my living room with a glass of sparkling water and a bowl of popcorn. And I didn't feel sorry for myself. Not exactly. I just felt the very specific loneliness of being a person who had given everything they had to another person and was now discovering that sacrifice doesn't come with a guarantee. You love someone with your whole self, and you give up things you can never get back, and you do it willingly, joyfully even, because you believe in them. And then you find out slowly, the way you find out the most devastating things, that the person you built doesn't remember what they were built from. In February, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering complex information. "Is this Evelyn Marion Harper?" "It is," I said. "My name is Douglas Fenn. I'm an attorney representing the estate of a Mr. Lawrence Arden. I believe you may have been acquainted with him at some point. He was a distant relative on your mother's side. We've been attempting to locate you for several months." I sat down slowly in my kitchen chair. "I'm afraid Mr. Arden passed away in October," the attorney continued. "He had no immediate surviving family. His estate, which is considerable, includes a number of specific bequests in his will, and your name appears prominently among them." I said, "I'm sorry. What?" "Mrs. Harper, I'd like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss the details, but I want to prepare you. This is a substantial matter." That night, after the call, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving. The soup pot was on the stove. The streetlight outside my window made a long stripe across the floor. I thought about Lawrence Arden. I did know that name, distantly. The way you know names from family gatherings you attended as a child and half forgot. A great uncle of some kind. A quiet man, I seemed to remember, who lived somewhere in the Northwest, whom I'd met maybe twice and who had always treated me with a gentle formality that I now understood, or thought I might understand as the formality of someone who was watching carefully and deciding something. I thought about all of it. And then I went to bed and lay in the dark and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, something that felt cautiously like a shift. I didn't know yet what was coming. I didn't know what that phone call would mean, or where it would lead, or what it would change. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was not entirely without resource, like someone, somewhere, had thought of me. The meeting with Douglas Fenn took place on a Thursday morning in early March, in a law office on the 14th floor of a building downtown that I had walked past hundreds of times without ever having a reason to enter. I wore the navy dress. It was the nicest thing I owned, and I knew it, and I didn't feel ashamed of that. I just felt it, the way you feel the specific weight of your own circumstances when you're sitting across from someone whose world is made of polished mahogany and framed diplomas. Douglas Fenn was a man in his mid-50s, compact and precise, with reading glasses he took off and put back on several times during the meeting. He had the manner of someone who delivered important news regularly and had learned not to lead with the dramatic parts. He opened a file folder and laid 2 documents on the desk between us. "Mr. Lawrence Arden," he said, "passed away on October 9th at his home in Astoria, Oregon. He was 81 years old. He had no spouse, no children, and no siblings living at the time of his death." He looked at me over his glasses. "He was your mother's first cousin, which makes him your first cousin once removed." "I remember him," I said slowly. "Barely. My mother took me to see him when I was maybe 9 or 10. He had a house near the water. He was very quiet." "That was his nature," Fenn said. He almost smiled. "He was a private man. Made his money in timber and real estate holdings over 40 years, lived simply, and was very deliberate about what he left behind." He tapped the document on the left. "This is his will. You're named in it, Mrs. Harper, specifically and by full name." I looked at the document without touching it. How did he know to name me? I hadn't spoken to him since I was a child. He kept track of family, quietly. Fenn removed his glasses. "He told me, when we drafted this will 4 years ago, that he had watched certain members of his extended family from a distance over the years, and that he was particular about who he wanted to benefit from what he'd built." A pause. "He spoke of you specifically. He said you were a woman who had done things the hard way and hadn't asked anyone for credit." Something moved through my chest that I couldn't quite name. Not happiness. More like being seen by someone you hadn't known was watching. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, because I'm not someone who goes in circles when there's a direct question to be asked. Douglas Fenn put his glasses back on, looked at the paper, and told me a number. I sat very still for a long moment. "That can't be right," I said. "It's right," he said. The figure he named was not the kind of number I had ever been in the same room with. It was the kind of number that existed in news articles and in conversations between people like Victor Whitmore. Liquid assets, property holdings, investment accounts, all of it, structured and detailed and waiting. All of it, apparently, mine. I looked at my hands in my lap. They were the same hands they'd always been. The knuckles a little rough, a small scar on my right index finger from a can opener when Brandon was 7. The same hands that had pushed a cleaning cart through an empty law firm at 10 o'clock at night. "What do I do?" I said. And I meant it practically. I genuinely didn't know the mechanics of what came next, but it came out sounding like something bigger. Ben understood both meanings. "You take your time," he said simply, "and you let me walk you through it." I walked out of that building an hour later into the March cold, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and the city moved around me the way it always did, indifferent and continuous, and I thought, everything just changed, and nobody on this street knows it, and I'm not sure I know what to do with it yet. I went home. I made tea. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I did not call Brandon. Tim, I want to be honest about why I didn't call him. It wasn't strategy, not at first. It was something more instinctive than that. A feeling, deep and not entirely comfortable, that I needed to understand what this meant before I said a word to anyone. That I needed to sit with it quietly until I knew what I was holding. But underneath that, and I'll admit this because I think you deserve the truth of what was going on in me, underneath that was something else. Something I didn't like feeling but couldn't pretend wasn't there. I wanted to see what would happen if he didn't know. I wanted to see who he was when there was nothing to gain. It wasn't a generous impulse. I know that. But I had been sitting in the margins of my son's life for 2 years, watching him choose other people's company over mine, watching him stand beside Victor Whitmore like a man who had found the father he'd always wanted and was determined not to look back. And some part of me, the tired part, the part that had been quietly bleeding for a long time, wanted to know, without any doubt, who my son was underneath the choices he'd been making. So I said nothing. I went to 3 more meetings with Douglas Fenn and his team. I made decisions, careful, unhurried decisions, with the help of a financial advisor Fenn recommended, a calm woman named Patricia who sat across from me and treated my uncertainty with patience rather than condescension. I signed papers. I asked questions. I took notes on a yellow legal pad in my own handwriting because writing things down was how I made them real. And through all of it, Brandon called me twice. Both times short. Both times about nothing in particular. Once to say he'd seen something on the news about a neighborhood near where I lived and wanted to make sure I was okay. Once to tell me, almost as an afterthought, at the end of a call about nothing, that Victor was hosting a formal celebration in 2 months. A dinner to announce Brandon's promotion to a senior director position within Whitmore Capital Group. "I wanted to let you know," he said, and something in how he said it made me understand that telling me was a courtesy and not an invitation. "That's a big deal," I said. "Congratulations." "Thanks. Victor's been grooming me for this for a while. It's a real opportunity, Mom." Victor's been grooming me. I turned those words over. "Are you happy in the work?" I asked. "Not just the title, the actual work." A brief pause. "Yeah, absolutely. It's what I've been working toward." "Good," I said. "That matters." There was a beat of silence, and then he said, "Are you going to come to the dinner?" That surprised me. I hadn't expected an invitation at all. "Do you want me there?" I asked directly. "Of course I do," he said. And then, after a moment, it'll be formal. Victor's clients, some investors, important people. So just, you know. As if I needed to be reminded of what I was and wasn't. "I'll think about it," I said. After I hung up, I sat with that phrase, and let it settle into me the way cold water settles. He hadn't meant it cruelly. That was the part that was hard to hold on to. He hadn't meant it cruelly. He just hadn't thought about how it would land. He had stopped thinking about how things landed with me a long time ago because I had always absorbed it quietly, and quiet absorption teaches people that it's okay to keep going. That was my failure too, I realized. I had been too quiet for too long. I called Ruth Ann that Thursday evening. She answered on the second ring the way she always did. "I've been waiting for you to call me," she said. "Don't ask me how I know something's happening, I just do." That almost made me smile. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not make a big thing of it right away. I just need to say it out loud." "Go ahead." I told her about Lawrence Arden, about the will, the meetings, the number. I said it plainly, without drama, the way Fen had said it to me, and when I finished, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough that I said her name. "I'm here," Ruth Ann said. Her voice had gone careful. "Evelyn, that is a serious amount of money. I know. What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet. I have some ideas, but that's not really what I'm thinking about right now." She waited. "I'm thinking about whether to tell Brandon," I said. Ruth Ann was quiet again for a moment, then, "And what's stopping you?" "I want to know if he's going to invite me to this dinner because he wants me there, or because he thinks he should." I heard her breathe out slowly. "Those are two very different things." "Yes, they are." "Evelyn," she paused, "I love you. And I want to say this carefully because I mean it carefully. If you already know the answer, you don't need a test to prove it. You just have to decide what you're going to do with what you already know." I held the phone and looked at the yellow legal pad on my kitchen table, covered in my own notes. Numbers and dates and terms I'd learned in the past 3 weeks. A life being quietly reorganized. "I know," I said, "but I still need to see it. Do you understand? I need to see it with my own eyes." She was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said finally. "I think I do." What happened in the weeks before the dinner was something I hadn't anticipated. Brandon started calling more often. Not dramatically more, not the Sunday calls of his college years, but enough that I noticed. 3 times in 3 weeks. Once he asked if I wanted to get lunch sometime, which was the first time he'd suggested anything like that in over a year. We met at a diner near my apartment, Neutral Ground, a Tuesday afternoon. He arrived 5 minutes late, slightly distracted the way he often was now, like part of his attention was always somewhere else. But he sat down, and he ordered coffee, and he looked at me and said, "You look good, Mom." "You look tired," I said, because it was true. He laughed a little. "Victor keeps a punishing schedule, but it's worth it. The opportunity is real, Mom. When this promotion goes through, I'll have actual equity in the company. That's not nothing." "No," I said, "it's not nothing." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. "Is that what you want? Equity in Victor's company? Wouldn't you?" He looked genuinely puzzled, like the answer was too obvious to require examination. "I wanted different things at your age," I said. "I wanted to make sure you had what you needed. That was enough for me then." Something shifted in his face, not guilt exactly, more like a flinch, quickly covered. "You sacrificed a lot," he said. He said it carefully, like the words were made of something fragile. "I know that." "Do you?" He met my eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw him. The boy behind the man, the person I had spent 20 years building towards something. He was still in there. I knew he was. But he had made choices that buried him deeper than I could reach on a Tuesday afternoon in a diner booth. "Brandon," I said, "I need you to tell me something honestly." "Okay." "When you think about where you came from, about how we lived, what we went through, are you ashamed of it?" The flinch again, quicker this time. "No," he said. "Don't answer fast. Think about it." He looked down at the table. The diner was quiet around us, just the sound of someone in the kitchen and the low murmur of another conversation somewhere behind us. "I'm not ashamed of you," he said finally. "I'm not, but I'll be honest. I don't always want people to know everything, about before, about the apartment, the cleaning job, all of it." He looked up. "That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" I said. He didn't answer. I didn't push. We ate lunch and talked about other things. A show he'd been watching, something about my neighbor's cat that had gotten into a situation with a drain pipe. Small things, the kind of conversation that fills space without going anywhere. When we stood up to leave, he hugged me. A real hug, not the arm's-length kind from the wedding. And I held on to it because I knew, in the way I always knew things I didn't want to know, that this moment was a window and not a door. 3 weeks before the dinner, Victor Whitmore called me directly. That had never happened before. His number showed up on my phone as unknown, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Evelyn," he said. No preamble. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Not at all, I said, because I was going to be composed regardless. Brandon tells me he extended an invitation to you for the dinner. I wanted to reach out personally. The pause that followed was very short, but I heard what was in it, a calculation completing itself. I think it would be lovely to have you there. Something was different. The careful measurement was still in his voice, but the warmth, the assembled warmth, was turned up higher than usual, like he'd decided to invest more in it. Thank you, Victor, I said. Brandon's accomplished something remarkable, he said, and it's important for family to be there. I've always believed that. I let that sit for a moment before I responded. You've always believed that. The man who had suggested to my son that I not attend a business dinner because I might be uncomfortable. The man who had smiled at me with his assembled smile at a party while his guests sized me up from across the room. I appreciate the call, I said. I'm planning to be there. Wonderful. Another pause, and this one was different, almost probing. You know, I've been meaning to sit down with you properly for some time. We've never really had a real conversation, have we? Just the two of us. No, I said. We haven't. We should fix that. Brandon means a great deal to me, and the people who matter to Brandon, they matter to me as well. I said, I'm sure that's true, and I kept my voice entirely pleasant, and after we hung up, I sat very still and thought about why Victor Whitmore had chosen this particular moment to call me and turn up the warmth. And I thought, he's heard something, or he suspects something, not the details. Those had been kept very close between me and Fenn's office and Patricia, the financial advisor, and nobody in that circle would have said a word. But Victor was the kind of man who paid attention to shifts, who noticed when the weather changed and repositioned accordingly. Ruth Ann, when I told her, said, "He smells money." "He doesn't know," I said. "He doesn't know the facts," she said. "But people like that have instincts. Something's different about you, Evelyn. You hold yourself differently. You probably don't even notice it, but I do." Maybe she was right. I thought about the woman who had sat at the edge of a party for 2 hours and said nothing. And I thought about the woman who now sat across from attorneys and financial advisors and asked precise, considered questions and made her own decisions. They were the same woman, but something in her had straightened. The night before the dinner, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about what I was walking into. I wasn't naive about it. I knew that room would be full of people who had a fixed idea of who I was, and that fixed idea had nothing to do with the reality of my life or what I was capable of. I knew Brandon would be navigating his own complicated position. I knew Victor would be performing because Victor was always performing, and I was beginning to understand that the performance was the man. There wasn't much underneath it that was different. What I didn't know, what I genuinely couldn't predict, was how Brandon would move through the evening when I was in the room. Whether he would find me and stand near me, or whether he would keep his distance the way he had at his own wedding, letting the space between us speak without ever acknowledging what it said. I thought about Lawrence Arden, about a quiet man in a house near the water who had watched from a distance and made a decision, who had seen something in me worth seeing when other people were looking past me. I thought about what I was going to do with what he'd left me. The ideas had been forming slowly, the way things form when you give them room and time. I wasn't ready to talk about them yet, but they were there, real and purposeful in mine. I got up at 2 a.m. and made tea and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and I thought, tomorrow is going to be the moment where I see clearly what I've already half known, and then I'm going to have to decide what to do with what I see. I was 63 years old. I was tired in the deep way I'd always been tired, but I was also, for the first time in a very long time, not afraid. I drank my tea, I went back to bed, and in the morning I put on the navy dress for the last time, because after tonight, I told myself, I was going to buy a new one. The Whitmore estate looked different at night than it had on that November afternoon 6 months earlier when I'd sat at the edge of a party and watched my son belong somewhere I didn't. At night, with the grounds lit from below and the windows of the main house glowing amber, the place looked like something from a magazine, the kind of photograph that makes you feel the distance between your life and someone else's in a way that's almost physical. I sat in my car in the parking area for a moment before going in, not because I was nervous exactly, more because I wanted to be deliberate. I wanted to walk into that building knowing exactly who I was and what I was there for, so that nothing that happened inside could take that away from me. I was there for my son, whatever remained of him that still belonged to both of us. I got out of the car and straightened the navy dress, the last time I had promised myself, and walked to the front entrance. The ballroom was something I hadn't seen on my previous visit. They'd opened it for this occasion, a long, high-ceilinged room at the back of the house that connected to a terrace overlooking the grounds. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces of white flowers I still couldn't name, candles and glass votives, string lighting along the terrace edge. Maybe 80 guests already present when I arrived, with more coming in behind me. Waitstaff moving through the room with practiced efficiency, trays of champagne and small food I couldn't identify. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood near the entrance for a moment, getting my bearings. Brandon found me in about 3 minutes. He came through the crowd with the particular movement of someone who has learned to work a room, stopping and touching elbows and smiling, and when he reached me, he looked genuinely glad to see me, which surprised me enough that I felt it. "You came," he said, and kissed me on the cheek. "You invited me," I said. "I know. I'm glad." He looked at me for a moment, actually looked, the way he used to when he was young, and something was on his mind he hadn't figured out how to say yet. "You look good, Mom." "You said that at lunch, too." I meant it both times. He touched my arm briefly. "Come on. I want to introduce you to some people." What followed was 20 minutes of exactly the kind of social performance I had expected, though not in the way I'd feared. Brandon introduced me to 4 or 5 people, a couple named Hargrove, who managed some kind of investment portfolio, a younger man named Seth, who worked in the company's development division, a woman named Helen, who had been Cassandra's school friend, and who smiled at me warmly in the way some people do when they're not sure what category you belong in, but have decided kindness is safer than the alternative. Brandon kept his hand at my elbow for most of it, which I noticed. He said "my mother" every time, clearly, without hesitation, without any of the slight glossing over I had braced for. For a stretch of those 20 minutes, I thought, maybe I've been wrong. Maybe the lunch, the calls, Victor's phone call. Maybe all of it meant he was genuinely trying. Maybe something had shifted in him without me seeing it happen. Then Victor entered the room. I don't mean that dramatically. He didn't appear in a doorway with a spotlight. He just came in from the far side, with Cassandra beside him and 2 men I didn't recognize on either side of them, and the room responded to his entrance the way rooms respond to people who have trained them to do so. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted, the way water shifts when something displaces it. Eyes moved. People straightened slightly. Brandon's hand left my elbow. Not obviously. Not a yank or a flinch. Just a gradual withdrawal, so smooth I might have imagined it if I hadn't been paying attention. Victor saw us. He came over. "Evelyn," he said, with the same assembled warmth from our phone call, dialed up another degree. "You made it. Brandon, your mother looks wonderful." "She does," Brandon said, and his voice had changed register slightly. The particular shift I had started to recognize, the way he modulated everything when Victor was present, turned it all just a half step toward performance. "We're so glad you're here," Cassandra said, and she was polite and pretty and as composed as she always was, and her gladness had nothing behind it but good manners, which I'd accepted a long time ago. "Thank you for having me," I said. Victor put a hand briefly on my shoulder, the first time he'd ever touched me, and said, "Family should be here for these moments. I've always believed that. Brandon has accomplished something exceptional, and the people who love him should be part of celebrating it." I looked at him and smiled and said, "Absolutely." And I thought, 3 months ago you told my son I might be uncomfortable in a room full of important people. I thought about how his voice had sounded on the phone, that probing quality, that slight recalibration, the smell of something, as Ruth Ann had put it. He didn't know, but he was circling. The formal part of the evening began about an hour in. Remarks from Victor at the front of the room, a microphone, the assembled guests seated or standing with their drinks. Brandon stood near the front beside Cassandra, and I was seated at a table toward the middle of the room with the Hargroves and Seth and Helen and two other people I hadn't been introduced to. Not at the front, not near Cassandra and Brandon, but not entirely at the edges either, and I noticed the small adjustment and gave it its due credit. Victor spoke well. That was the irritating truth. He was a skilled speaker, easy with humor, commanding without being domineering, the kind of man who could make a room full of people feel included in something whether they were or not. He talked about the company's growth, about strategic vision, about the next chapter. He talked about Brandon in terms that were genuinely impressive, specific about what Brandon had contributed, real about the business impact. He wasn't manufacturing it entirely. And then he made a mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was exactly what it looked like. He had been talking about the culture of the company, about the kind of people he chose to build with. He said something about how success wasn't accidental, that it came from the right environment, the right foundation, the right influences. And then he looked out at the room with a broad smile and said, "Brandon came to us from humble beginnings, very humble. And look at what the right environment can do for a person." The room laughed, a light, easy laugh, the kind people give when they trust the person speaking to know the boundaries. I did not move. Victor's eyes swept the room in the way of a performer acknowledging his audience, and for just a moment they landed on me, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be undeniable. "I always say," he continued, still smiling, "that a good investment can transform anything, even raw material with very little to work with." Another ripple of laughter. The Hargrove beside me chuckled. Helen was looking at her champagne glass. Raw material with very little to work with. I sat with those words for exactly 2 seconds before I understood them completely. Understood who they were for and why they'd been said and what they were designed to do. This was not an accident of phrasing. Victor Whitmore was a precise man. He chose his words the way other men chose their suits. I looked at Brandon. He was looking at the floor. Just for a moment, a second, maybe less, his eyes dropped, and he looked at the floor and I saw his jaw tighten, and then he looked up again and his face was composed, and he was nodding at something Victor was saying. He heard it. He knew what it was. And he said nothing. That was the moment. The one I will carry for the rest of my life, not because of what Victor said. I had withstood worse from less significant people, but because of that single second of my son staring at the floor, because in that second I watched him choose. Quietly, invisibly, without anyone else in that room knowing a choice was being made. He chose to let it pass. He chose the floor over my eyes. He chose what he stood to gain over what he owed the woman who had built him. I breathed slowly. I kept my face entirely still. I was 63 years old, and I had been holding myself together through hard things for most of my adult life, and I was not going to come apart in Victor Whitmore's ballroom. Victor finished his remarks. There was applause. Brandon was called up to say a few words, and he was good, measured, grateful, self-possessed. He thanked Victor. He thanked the team. He thanked Cassandra. He said, near the end, "And my mother is here tonight, which means a lot to me." And he looked in my direction briefly, and people at the nearby tables turned to look at me for a moment with polite acknowledgement, which means a lot to me. He said it, and I believed he meant it, and I hated that it was so small. After everything, after the double shifts and the crackers on the linoleum and the 20 years, what he said in front of a room full of people was that I was there, and it meant a lot. Not, she built me from nothing. Not, she sacrificed things she can never get back. Not, I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for her. Just, she's here, and it means a lot. After the applause settled and people began moving again, I excused myself from the table. I needed air. I went toward the terrace doors, moving through the room carefully, and I had almost reached them when I nearly walked into a man I didn't recognize. Sharp-faced, 60s, in a very well-cut charcoal suit, carrying a leather satchel that looked entirely out of place at a dinner event. He was moving with purpose, scanning the room, and when his eyes landed on me, he stopped. "Excuse me," he said. "I apologize. I'm looking for a Mrs. Evelyn Harper. I was told she was a guest this evening." I looked at him. "I'm Evelyn Harper." Something shifted in his expression, professionalism locking into place over surprise. "Mrs. Harper." I'm Richard Crane, from the firm of Crane and Associates. He reached into his jacket and produced a card. I'm an inheritance attorney. I've been asked to deliver some documentation to you personally, and when my office reached your home and received no answer, we were told you'd be here this evening. A pause. I apologize for the interruption. This is an unusual way to do things, I know. I looked at the card and then at him. What kind of documentation? There have been some additional developments in the Arden estate, he said with careful precision. Some holdings that weren't fully cataloged in the initial review. Mr. Fenn from our affiliated office asked me to bring this directly to you. He patted the satchel. There's a sealed document here, and I need your signature on a confirmation of receipt if you're willing. I stood there for a moment. The terrace door was 2 feet away. The party continued behind me. And somewhere across the room, my son was accepting congratulations from people who had just heard him described as raw material that the right environment had transformed. All right, as I said. I don't know how it happened. Whether someone had seen us talking, whether the movement of 2 people standing still in a moving room drew eyes the way stillness sometimes does, or whether it was Victor's specific gift for surveillance. But as Richard Crane opened the satchel and produced a sealed envelope and a document for my signature, I became aware that the quality of the room had changed. The conversation hadn't stopped, but something had shifted. Eyes had moved, the way they had when Victor came in. And then Victor was there. He had covered the distance from across the room in the time it took me to sign my name, which told me something about how fast he could move when he felt something slipping. "Evelyn," he said pleasantly, "is everything all right?" "Fine, thank you," I said. His eyes went to Richard Crane, to the satchel, to the sealed envelope in my hands. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, calculating, and then covered. "This is a business acquaintance," I said, which was not a lie. "Just some paperwork." "Of course," Victor said. But he didn't move away. He stood there with his pleasant expression and his assembled warmth, and he looked at Richard Crane with the specific attention of a man who memorizes things. Crane, to his credit, was entirely composed. "I'll leave you to the evening," he said to me. "Mr. Fenn will follow up next week." He nodded to Victor with professional neutrality and moved back through the crowd toward the entrance. Victor watched him go. Then he looked at me, and for the first time that evening, the assembled warmth slipped, just fractionally, just for a second. And underneath it was something I recognized. Not anger, something colder and more deliberate. Assessment. He was reassessing me. "Old business?" I said lightly, and tucked the envelope into my bag. "Nothing interesting." "Of course," he said again. Brandon appeared beside him then, having noticed the small gravitational pull of Victor standing still in the middle of the room. He looked at me, and then at Victor, and then back at me with the expression of someone who has walked into a room and can feel the temperature but can't identify the source. "Everything okay?" he said. "Perfectly fine," I said. I looked at him for a moment, my son, in his good suit, in his new life, in his chosen world. I was actually just about to step out for some air. "I'll come with you," he said, and something in how quickly he said it made me think he meant it. We went out to the terrace. The night air was cool and damp, and the grounds below were lit softly, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Just stood side by side the way we used to stand on the small balcony of our apartment in the Clarendon complex on summer evenings when Brandon was in high school, and we didn't always need to fill the silence. Then he said, quietly, not looking at me, looking out at the grounds, "I'm sorry about what he said in there, the raw material comment." I let that sit for a moment. "Are you?" "Yes." He said it with something real in it. It wasn't okay." "No," I said. "It wasn't. I should have said something." "You should have," I agreed. I kept my voice even. Not cold. I wasn't performing calm. I actually was calm, in the deep, exhausted way of someone who has already done the hard work of understanding something. "But you didn't. And that's the part I'm going to remember, Brandon. Not what he said. What you didn't say." He was quiet. Below us, the grounds were still and dark at the edges, lit only where the lights reached. He had his hands on the terrace railing, and he was looking at them. I don't know how to navigate it, he said finally. Being between the two of you, there is no between, I said. Not harshly, just plainly. There's you, and there's the choices you make. That's all there ever is. He didn't answer, and then, from inside the ballroom, audible even through the closed terrace doors, came a sound that neither of us expected. A shift in the room, a kind of hush that moved through 80 people simultaneously. I turned and looked through the glass. I could see people turning, making space, the crowd parting slightly near the center of the room. Victor's head was visible above the guests, and he had turned toward the entrance, and his expression, even from a distance, even through glass, was no longer pleasant. Someone had arrived. Brandon straightened. I don't know, I said. I opened the terrace door and stepped back inside, and the crowd had pulled back enough that I could see clearly across the room to the entrance where Richard Crane was standing again. Not alone this time, but with two other people in suits, and one of them was Douglas Fenn. Fenn, who was my attorney, who was supposed to follow up next week. He saw me across the room. He lifted his chin slightly in acknowledgement, and then he looked at the sealed envelope I was still holding in my hand, the one he had sent with Crane, and he nodded once. Open it, that nod said. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. Then I looked up at Victor, who was looking at Fenn with an expression that was no longer assembled at all. It was tight and controlled, and underneath the control was something that looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like fear. I opened the envelope, and what I read in the first 3 lines changed everything I thought I understood about what this evening was. The Arden estate had not been fully catalogued in the initial review. That part was true, exactly as Crane had said. What he hadn't said, what Fenn's attached letter explained in his careful, precise language, was why. Because Lawrence Arden had not only left me his personal holdings, he had left me his controlling interest in a land trust that held development rights to 3 parcels of commercial property in this region. 3 parcels that, according to the attached documentation, Whitmore Capital Group had been in active negotiation to acquire for the past 8 months. Active negotiation, with a trust that now belonged entirely to me. I stood in the middle of Victor Whitmore's ballroom with this information in my hands, and I looked up, and Victor was looking at me. And I understood now, completely, finally, without any remaining ambiguity, why he had called me, why he had turned up the warmth, why he had said, in his careful voice, that we had never had a real conversation, and that we should fix that. He hadn't smelled money in the abstract. He had smelled his own deal falling apart. He had known, or suspected, for weeks. And he had spent those weeks positioning himself with Brandon, with me, with this dinner, to be close enough to manage it when the moment came. The moment had come. Brandon was beside me now. He had come in from the terrace, and he was reading my face, and I could see him trying to parse what had happened in the 30 seconds since we'd come back inside. "Mom," he said quietly, "what's in the envelope?" I looked at my son. I thought about the terrace and what he'd said about not knowing how to navigate it, and I thought about the boy eating crackers on the kitchen floor, and I thought about Victor's eyes when the assembled warmth slipped. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in my bag. "A lot," I said. And I looked across the room at Douglas Fenn and gave him the smallest nod, and whatever came next was going to come from a very different position than the one I had occupied for the past 2 years. Douglas Fenn did not stay long that evening. He spoke with me for 11 minutes in a small sitting room off the main hallway, a room with a closed door, away from the noise of the ballroom, while Richard Crane waited near the entrance and Brandon stood in the hallway outside, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the careful blankness of a man trying not to look as rattled as he was. Fenn confirmed what the letter had said and added what the letter hadn't. The land trust had been a separate holding from Lawrence Arden's primary estate, held through a subsidiary structure that had taken Fenn's team several months to fully unwind and document. 3 parcels, all within 40 miles of the city, all zoned for commercial development. 2 of them were adjacent to existing Whitmore Capital Group properties. The third sat at the center of a development corridor that Victor had been quietly assembling for the better part of a decade. Whitmore's team has been in negotiation with the trust administrator for the past 8 months, Fenn said, sitting across from me with his hands folded on his knee. The former administrator passed away in January, which created a gap in representation. Our documentation establishing you as the new controlling interest was filed last week. His attorneys will have been notified around the same time. So he knew, I said. His attorneys knew. Whether he knew before tonight, Fenn paused. Given how quickly he made contact with you over the past several weeks, I think we can make a reasonable inference. I thought about the phone call. The warmth turned up high. We've never had a real conversation. The people who matter to Brandon matter to me. I sat with all of it for a moment, and then I said, "What happens now?" "That's entirely your decision," Fenn said. "You have options. You can engage with Whitmore's team and negotiate a sale on your own terms. You can decline to sell and develop the parcels independently. You can hold them. You are under no obligation to continue any prior negotiation on terms you didn't set." He looked at me steadily. "What I want you to understand is that his leverage in this situation is essentially zero. Legally, financially, you hold the position." I had never held a position before. Not in those terms. I had spent my adult life in positions of scarcity, always calculating, always trimming, always working with less than I needed and making it stretch. The idea of holding a position, of being the one with leverage rather than the one working around someone else's, was something I needed a moment to absorb. "I understand," I said. "Take your time," Fenn said. "Nothing needs to happen tonight. I wanted you to have the full picture." After he left, I sat in that small room alone for about 2 minutes, just breathing, letting the walls of it settle around me, the quiet, the closed door, the distance from everything outside it. Then I stood up, smoothed my dress, and went back out into the hallway. Brandon was still there. He pushed off the wall when he saw me, and his eyes were asking 20 questions he hadn't figured out how to order yet. "Can you tell me what's going on?" he said. "Yes," I said, "but not tonight." "Mom, Brandon." I stopped and looked at him directly. "I'm going to go say goodnight to a few people, and then I'm going home. I'll call you this week and I'll explain everything, but I need you to let me do this at my own pace, not yours." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through his face that I couldn't fully name. Not quite frustration, not quite hurt. More like the specific disorientation of realizing that a person you've been taking for granted has been doing things you didn't know about. "Okay," he said finally. I went back into the ballroom. Victor found me within 4 minutes. He had the gift of surveillance, as I'd noted before, and he used it with the ease of someone who'd never had to be subtle about it, because people had always allowed him not to be. "Evelyn Sake," he said, appearing at my elbow near the bar. His voice was lower than it had been all evening. The performance had been adjusted, the room-filling warmth dialed back to something more focused, more direct. This was Victor operating in a register closer to his actual self. "That attorney, the one who came earlier and came back, that's Lawrence Arden's estate, isn't it?" He didn't phrase it as a question. I turned to look at him. "I'm not able to discuss the specifics of estate matters," I said pleasantly. "I'm sure you understand." His jaw shifted. "I've been in negotiation with that trust for 8 months," he said. "We were close to finalizing terms. This is—" He stopped, recalibrated. The veneer came back, thinner than before. "I just want to understand the situation clearly." "I appreciate that," I said. "My attorney will be in touch with your attorneys next week. I think that's the right way to handle it." "Your attorney?" He said it the way people say things they're still processing. "Evelyn, I think it would be better, more efficient, and frankly more comfortable for everyone involved if we handled this directly. Between us. Family." There it was. Family. The word he'd deployed all evening like a tool he kept polished for specific use. I looked at him. He was a tall man and broad, and he was accustomed to being looked at from a position of wanting something from him. He was not accustomed to being looked at the way I was looking at him now, with nothing to want, and nothing to protect, and nothing to lose. "Victor," I said, in the same pleasant tone I'd been using all night, "I don't think we've ever been family. I think we've been polite to each other because my son married your daughter, and because you needed something from me that you didn't tell me you needed, and because I was patient for longer than I should have been." I paused. My attorney will be in touch next week. I watched the warmth leave his face entirely. What remained underneath it was not rage. Victor Whitmore was too controlled for rage in public. It was a cold, precise attention, the look of a man recalculating. "You should think carefully," he said quietly, "about the position this puts your son in." There it was, the real thing finally, the card he'd been holding, waiting to play. Brandon's position, Brandon's equity, Brandon's future at the company. I felt it land. I won't pretend I didn't. That particular threat, delivered quietly at a party by a man who held my son's professional life in his hands, was designed to hit the oldest and most reliable wound I had. And it did. I felt it. But I'd been thinking about Brandon's position for 2 years. I had been thinking about it while I sat at the edges of parties, while I drove home from a wedding where my son said thanks for coming, while I lay awake in my apartment wondering at what point a mother's love becomes a permission slip for being treated as nothing. I had thought about it enough. "Brandon is a grown man," I said. "He'll find his way." I picked up a glass of water from the bar and turned away from Victor Whitmore. "Good night." I didn't sleep well that night either, in case you were wondering. What I'd said to Victor sounded clean and final in the ballroom, but alone in my apartment at midnight, it sat in my chest with a different weight. Because the truth was that I didn't know what Victor would do. He might do nothing, might calculate that pressing the issue would cost him more than it gained, might decide that the professional and legal path was his only real option. Or he might not. And Brandon was in the middle of it. Brandon, who had stood with his hands on a terrace railing and said, "I don't know how to navigate it," who had looked at the floor for one devastating second rather than look at me. I called Ruth Ann at 7 in the morning because she was always up by 6:30, and she answered the phone with, "I saw the caller ID and I've been sitting here waiting." I told her everything, the full account, start to finish, the ballroom and the terrace, and Victor's face when the warmth slipped and the threat at the end. She listened without interrupting, which she could do when something was serious enough. When I finished, she said, "How do you feel?" "Like I ran a marathon in the wrong shoes," I said, "but not like you lost." "No," I said, "not like I lost." "Good." A pause. "What are you going to do about Brandon?" That was the question I'd been turning over all night. "I'm going to call him," I said, "and I'm going to tell him the truth. All of it. Not to hurt him, just because he deserves to know what's been happening, and I'm done managing how much he knows to protect him from things he's old enough to handle." "And Victor? The land trust?" "I'm going to do what Fenn advised," I said. "I'm going to think about it carefully, and I'm going to make decisions based on what I actually want to do with it, not based on what makes Victor comfortable." "What do you want to do with it?" I'd been thinking about that too. The ideas that had been forming since those first weeks in Fenn's office, slow and deliberate, the way things form when you stop letting urgency crowd out clarity. "I want to sell one of the parcels," I said. "Not to Victor, to someone else. A fair sale, at market value, to someone who'll develop it well. And the proceeds from that, I want to put towards some things I've been thinking about." "What kind of things?" "Scholarships," I said. "For kids who are doing it the way Brandon and I did it, working with nothing, trying to get somewhere. And maybe something else. A community resource fund. Families who need a bridge, help with childcare, job training, basic stability." I paused. The kind of help nobody gave us. There was a silence on the other end of the line that felt like something opening up. "Evelyn," Ruth Ann said softly, "I know it sounds like a lot." "It doesn't sound like a lot. It sounds exactly like you." Another pause. "What about the other 2 parcels?" "I'm going to hold them for now, and let Victor negotiate properly, through attorneys, with no special treatment for being my son's father-in-law." I looked out my kitchen window at the morning, which was gray and ordinary and mine. He can bid like anyone else. Brandon came to my apartment 3 days later. He didn't call first. He knocked on the door on a Saturday morning, which told me how much the ballroom had unsettled him because Brandon did not do unannounced visits. He stood in the doorway with his jacket collar turned up against the March wind, and he said, "Can I come in?" I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat with my yellow legal pad, where I'd drunk tea at 2 in the morning, where I'd eaten soup while he'd told me not to come to a dinner. The table that had witnessed more of my interior life than any other piece of furniture I owned. I told him everything, more carefully than I'd told Ruth Ann, because the stakes were different, and because I wanted him to be able to hear it without shutting down. I told him about Lawrence Arden and the will, about the months of quiet meetings with Fen and Patricia. I told him the size of what had been left to me. I told him about the land trust and the 3 parcels and the negotiations Victor had been conducting and what it meant that the trust now belonged to me. I told him about Victor's phone call, about being invited to the dinner. Now, suddenly, warmly, after 2 years of being a person who made things uncomfortable, I told him what I believed Victor had known and when. I told him what Victor had said to me at the bar, about his position. Brandon sat across from me through all of this, and he was very still. He had his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and he was looking at the table between us, and he didn't interrupt once. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He knew," not a question. "His attorneys had been notified the week before," I said. "He put it together." Brandon set his mug down very carefully, the way you set something down when you need your hands to be still. "He called me in for a meeting 2 weeks before the dinner," he said slowly. "Told me he wanted to accelerate the promotion, that the timing was right, that he had a lot of confidence in my trajectory. He said it flatly, like he was reading from a list. I thought—" He stopped. "You thought he'd seen something in you that he wanted to invest in," I said. Not unkindly. "Yeah." A beat. "Maybe he did. I don't know. Maybe both things can be true at once." "Maybe," I said. "Probably, actually. Victor isn't simple, but the timing is what it is." Brandon looked up at me then. Really looked, the way he had on the terrace. Not performing looking, but actually making eye contact and holding it. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "About the inheritance, any of it, all those months." I looked back at him. "I needed to understand what I was holding before I said anything," I said. And I paused, deciding to be honest because I had decided to stop managing what he knew. "I wanted to see who you were when there was nothing to gain, when I was just your mother with nothing special to offer." The words landed visibly. I watched them go in. "Mom," he said quietly. "I'm not saying it to hurt you," I said. "I'm saying it because it's true. And I think you already know it's true." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car passed on the street below. The refrigerator hummed, ordinary sounds that felt very loud. He stopped, started again. "I've been doing things wrong," he said, "for a while now. I think I knew it, and I kept explaining it to myself in ways that made it sound okay." He looked at his hands. The thing he said at the dinner. The raw material comment. I should have— "Yes," I said. "You should have." "I know." He rubbed one hand over his face. "I don't know why I didn't. I wanted to. I thought about it, and then I just—" "You chose not to," I said gently. "You can call it whatever you want, but that's what happened. And I'm not going to pretend it didn't." Another silence. Longer this time. "Are you going to sell to him?" Brandon said finally. "The parcels." "Not on his terms," I said. "One I'll sell through proper channels at fair market value. The other 2 I'll hold. His team can negotiate like anyone else." Brandon nodded slowly. I could see him absorbing what that meant. What it meant for his position, his equity, his trajectory at Whitmore Capital Group. And I waited to see what he would do with it. He said, "That's fair." 2 words. But they meant something because he knew exactly what they cost him to say, and he said them anyway. I reached across the table and put my hand over his briefly. He looked surprised, not because I'd touched him, but I think because in that moment he hadn't expected kindness. He had expected consequences, which he deserved, and I was going to make sure he felt those. But I also loved him. Both of those things existed simultaneously, and I wasn't going to pretend they didn't. I'm not done being angry, I said. I want you to know that, and there's a lot between us that isn't fixed by one conversation. I know, he said. But I'm also not done, I said. With you, with us. I just need you to understand that things are different now. I'm different now. And I need you to show me, not tell me, show me that you understand what you've done. He looked at me steadily. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. What happened over the following weeks was not a clean resolution. I want to be clear about that. Life doesn't run on that kind of timeline, and people don't change in the span of a single kitchen table conversation, no matter how honest it is. Victor's attorneys contacted Fenn's office the following Tuesday. The tone of the correspondence, according to Fenn, had undergone a significant adjustment from the 8 months prior. There were no more casual informalities, no appeals to family or warmth. Just the precise, somewhat taut language of people negotiating from a position that had shifted beneath them without warning. Patricia, the financial advisor, walked me through 3 different scenarios for the parcels over the course of 2 meetings. I asked detailed questions. I took notes on the yellow legal pad. I made decisions that were mine, based on what I actually wanted, not on what would make anyone else comfortable, and not on what would punish anyone either. I wasn't interested in using what Lawrence Arden had left me as a weapon. I was interested in using it as what it actually was, a resource, a foundation, something to build from. The scholarship fund took shape over those same weeks, in conversation with a nonprofit attorney Fenn recommended. We structured it simply. Annual awards for graduating high school seniors from lower-income households in the county, prioritizing first-generation college students, with a preference for students who had held jobs during high school. The kind of students I used to see at Brandon School who were always doing 2 things at once because they had to be. I thought about what to call it. Ruth Ann, characteristically, said I should call it the Harper Foundation and leave it at that. She had no patience for modesty when she felt it was serving avoidance. I thought about it for a few days, and then I called Fenn and told him to file the paperwork under a different name, the Arden Harper Foundation. Because Lawrence Arden had made it possible, and because I wanted to carry his name alongside mine into whatever this became. Brandon found out about the scholarship fund through Cassandra, who had heard it from someone in the community. It had been mentioned in a local paper's brief about new nonprofit filings. He called me that evening, and he sounded different from how he'd sounded in any call in recent memory. Less managed, less careful. "You're setting up scholarships," he said. "Yes. For kids who need help getting to college. And some community resource programming, still working on the structure for that part." A pause. "Mom." His voice had something in it I hadn't heard in a long time. A rawness that the past 2 years had smoothed over. That's a real thing. That's going to matter to real people." "That's the idea," I said. "I want to help," he said. "Not with money. I know that's not... I just mean, I want to be involved. If you'd let me." I turned that over for a moment. The truth was, I hadn't thought about involving Brandon. Not because I'd decided against it, but because I'd been focused on building the thing, and including him hadn't been part of the picture I'd been painting. "Let me think about it," I said. "Honestly?" "Okay," he said, and then, "Mom, I'm sorry for a lot. I know sorry isn't a thing I can just say once and have it mean everything it needs to mean, but I am." "I know you are," I said. "Is that enough?" He said it with a vulnerability I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager, since those nights when something hard had happened at school and he hadn't known how to handle it, and he'd come to the kitchen where I was and just stood near me without saying anything. "It's a start," I said. That was honest, too. The last thing I need to tell you about this part of the story is what I found out 6 weeks after the ballroom, through Fenn, through the particular kind of quiet efficiency with which information moved through legal and financial channels when you had the right people looking. Victor Whitmore's company had a problem. Not a new problem. A problem that had been building for some time, hidden under the surface of the expansion and the galas and the confident announcements. Several of his development projects had significant financing gaps. Two investors who had been expected to commit had quietly withdrawn. There were liens on two properties that hadn't appeared in any public documentation. The three parcels in the Arden Land Trust, the ones he'd been negotiating to acquire for 8 months, had been central to his plan to restructure that financing. Acquiring them at the price he'd been negotiating with the former administrator would have given him the development corridor he needed to bring new investors in and cover the gaps. That plan was no longer available to him in the form he'd designed it. What that meant for Brandon's equity position, for his future at the company, I didn't know yet, and that was the part that kept me up at night even then, even after everything. Not because I regretted my decisions, but because the consequences of Victor's choices were going to fall on people who hadn't made them, and Brandon was one of those people, and he was still my son. I sat with that for a long time. The unfairness of it, not toward me, but toward Brandon, toward Cassandra even, toward anyone whose future was tied to a structure that someone else had built on a shaky foundation and dressed up beautifully on the outside. You can do everything right and still get caught in someone else's collapse. That was a truth I'd learned the first time when Brandon's father walked out on a Tuesday. I was learning it again now, differently, from a different angle. I folded up the information and put it where I put things I wasn't ready to act on but couldn't afford to ignore. Because whatever came next, whatever Victor's collapse would look like when it finally surfaced, and whatever it would mean for Brandon, I was going to face it standing up, with resources, with people I trusted around me, with my name on a foundation that was already beginning to do something real in the world. I was not the woman who had sat at the edges of a party anymore, and I was not going back. The collapse, when it came, was not loud. That surprised me somehow. I think I'd been bracing for something dramatic, a headline, a sudden announcement, the kind of public unraveling that matches the scale of what's being lost. But that's not how these things actually happen. They happen quietly, in legal filings and closed-door meetings and phone calls that don't get returned, and the world keeps moving around them while the people inside them try to hold the walls up with their bare hands. I found out through Fen on a Tuesday morning in May. He called me before 9, which he didn't usually do, and his voice had that careful quality it got when he was managing information he knew would land hard. Whitmore Capital Group has filed for creditor protection, he said. It was filed late yesterday. It'll be public by end of day. I sat down at my kitchen table. The yellow legal pad was still there. A new one by now, the original long since filled. How bad? I asked. Significant, Ben said. The financing gaps were larger than what I'd outlined to you last month. There are 3 projects in default. His primary institutional lender withdrew their commitment in April, which appears to have accelerated everything. A pause. Brandon's equity position, the shares he was granted as part of the promotion package, they're tied to company performance. This is going to affect their value substantially. I closed my eyes for a moment. How substantially? Patricia can walk you through the specifics, but in the near term, significantly. The long term depends on how the restructuring proceeds, and that could take years. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a long time, not thinking about Victor. I had thought about Victor enough, and what I felt toward him was not satisfaction and not pity, but something more tired than either of those. Something closer to the feeling you get when you've been watching a structure lean for a long time and you finally hear it fall. Just the dull, heavy landing of an inevitable thing. What I was thinking about was Brandon. He called me that afternoon. His voice was controlled in the way people's voices get when they are working very hard to sound controlled and not entirely succeeding. I assume you've heard, he said. Fen called me this morning, I said. Are you all right? A short silence. Cassandra and we're figuring out what this means. For the house, for everything. He stopped. Victor is saying it's manageable, that the restructuring will preserve the core assets, but his attorneys are saying something different to our attorneys, so another stop. I don't know what's true yet. Brandon, I said, are you all right? Not the finances, you. The silence this time was longer. Honestly, he said. No, not really. Something shifted in his voice, came loose just slightly. I've spent 3 years building something inside someone else's structure, and I knew, somewhere I knew, that Victor was the kind of man who built things beautifully on the outside and paid less attention to what was holding them up. I knew that, and I decided it wasn't my problem because I was getting what I wanted. He paused. That was stupid. It was human, I said. Stupid and human are usually the same thing. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know yet. He exhaled. What I know is that I've been doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons for a while now, and whatever comes next, I want it to be different. I don't know exactly what that looks like. That's a start, I said. The same words I'd used in March, at the kitchen table, when he'd apologized. He recognized them. I could tell from the brief pause. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm starting to think that's all any of it ever is. Victor Whitmore called me once during those weeks. Just once, and just briefly, and he did not deploy any warmth at all this time. He said he wanted me to understand that the land trust situation was a factor in the company's difficulties. He said it directly. I'll give him that, without dressing it up. I know, I said. I'm not. He stopped. For a moment he sounded like something other than the man who had assembled himself so carefully in front of every room he'd ever entered. He sounded tired, old. I made decisions based on assumptions that didn't hold, he said. The trust was one of several things that didn't go the way I'd planned. I understand, I said. Brandon shouldn't suffer for my miscalculations, he said, and there was something real in it. Whatever else Victor was, whatever calculations had driven his decisions, I believed in that moment that he meant what he said about Brandon. No, I said. He shouldn't, but he might. And that's a consequence of decisions you made, Victor, not mine. A long silence. No, he said finally, not yours. That was the last conversation I had with Victor Whitmore for a long time. Not because it ended in hostility. It didn't. It ended in a kind of mutual exhaustion, the kind that comes at the end of something that has finally reached its actual conclusion. He was a man who had built an empire on a foundation he'd allowed to erode, and now he was living with what that meant, and there was nothing I had to say to him that would help with that, or hurt him further. I had stopped wanting to hurt him sometime in those weeks between the ballroom and the filing. I'm not sure exactly when. But at some point the anger had shifted into something quieter and more settled. And what was left was not forgiveness. Not yet, not entirely, but a kind of release. Like setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long, you forgot it wasn't attached to you. The first Arden Harper Foundation scholarships were awarded in June. 4 of them in that inaugural year, 4 graduating seniors from county high schools, each of them first-generation college students, each of them carrying the particular kind of tiredness in their eyes that I recognized from the inside. The tiredness of doing everything with less than you need and not being able to stop. The award ceremony was small. A meeting room at the county library, folding chairs, a table with a cake that Ruth Ann had insisted on making herself. Lemon, because she'd asked each of the recipients what their favorite flavor was, and lemon had won by a vote of 3-1. I sat in the front row and watched each of those 4 young people come up to receive their award, and I thought about Brandon at 17 in our apartment, talking about wanting to run a company someday, and about the 23-year-old woman I had once been, sitting on a kitchen floor next to a little boy eating crackers, saying, "It's just us now, baby, but we're going to be okay." What I felt was not triumph. I want to be precise about that. It wasn't the feeling of having won something. It was something quieter and more durable than that. A sense of alignment, of having taken something painful and turned it into something that faced outward, toward other people. Of having used what I'd been given to do, what I'd always believed needed doing. Brandon was there. He sat 2 seats down from me. He'd asked to come, and I'd said yes, and he'd shown up early and helped set up the chairs without being asked, which was the kind of thing I noticed and stored carefully. Cassandra had come too. She sat beside him, and she was composed as always, but the composure was softer than it used to be. Something in their marriage was being renegotiated, I understood, in the way that marriages have to be renegotiated when the external structure they were partly built on shifts. That was their work to do, not mine. When the ceremony ended and people were talking in clusters and Ruth Ann was distributing cake, Brandon came and stood beside me near the window. "How does it feel?" he said. "Real," I said. For the first time in a long time, something feels completely real. He nodded, looking out the window. Then he said, "I've been talking to someone, a therapist. Started a month ago." I looked at him. "Good," I said. I meant it without qualification. "She asked me to describe my relationship with you," he said. "Like, historically. I thought it would be easy, you know? I thought I'd say, my mom worked hard and I was grateful, simple story." He paused. "It took me the whole session, and I didn't get through half of it." "That sounds about right," I said. "She asked me when I stopped letting myself need you," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, just slightly, quickly recovered. I didn't have a clean answer. I think I thought needing you meant I hadn't made it. That having a mother who cleaned offices at night was something I was supposed to get far enough away from that it stopped mattering. The room was warm. The library's summer light came through the window at a low angle and fell across the floor between us. "The problem with getting far away from things," I said, "is that the things don't go anywhere. You just make yourself walk farther to avoid looking at them." "Yeah," he said, "I'm learning that." "Learning is good," I said. "Learning is actually the whole thing." He turned and looked at me then. "I know I don't get to just decide that things are okay now," he said. "I know this is slow, and I know that what I did, what I let happen, I can't just apologize my way out of it." "No," I said, "you can't. But I want to be someone different than who I've been," he said. "Not for you to forgive me. Just because when I actually look at it, I don't like who I was. And that should matter regardless of whether you're watching." I looked at my son, this tall, tired, uncertain man in a folding chair meeting room with lemon cake in the background. And I saw him more clearly than I had in years. Not the version he'd been performing for the Whitmore world. Not the version he'd shown at his own wedding or the party or the ballroom. Just him, imperfect and trying. "It does matter," I said. "That's exactly when it matters." But I sold one of the Arden parcels in August. Not to Whitmore Capital Group. Their restructuring was still in process. Their capacity to acquire anything on hold indefinitely. I sold it to a regional development firm through Fenn's facilitation at fair market value after 3 rounds of negotiation that I was present for and active in. Patricia sat beside me in every meeting. I asked questions I would not have known to ask a year earlier. The second parcel I donated to the County Housing Authority with a deed restriction for affordable residential development. Fenn had suggested it as a tax consideration, but it was more than that for me. It was the thing I had wanted to do when I first understood what I was holding, to take land and make it into stability for people who needed stability. It took 7 months of legal coordination, and it was not simple, and when it was finalized, it did not feel like a fairy tale. It felt like work that had been done correctly. The third parcel I kept, not for development, not for sale, just because it was mine and because I had spent enough of my life giving things away, and I was allowed to hold something simply because it belonged to me. The Arden Harper Foundation's second year of scholarships expanded to 8 awards. The community resource programming, the bridge fund I had outlined to Ruth Ann on the phone that March morning, launched in the fall. It was small and imperfect and ran into bureaucratic complications that took months to sort out, and some of the early grants went to families who used them well, and some went to families where the complications were too deep for money to touch, and I learned from both kinds. Ruth Ann joined the Foundation's advisory board. She accepted on the condition that she could be honest when she thought I was wrong, which I accepted because I had never known her to be any other way, and I needed that more than I needed agreement. Brandon joined too, 6 months after I'd said, "Let me think about it," not in a financial role. In a practical one, he organized the recipient interviews for the scholarship process, the part that required someone to sit across from nervous 17-year-olds and make them feel seen rather than assessed. He was good at it, which didn't surprise me entirely. He had always been good at seeing people when he chose to. The problem had been the choosing. He left Whitmore Capital Group in October. Not dramatically. The company's restructuring had reduced his position to something almost unrecognizable, and he made the decision cleanly and took time to think about what he actually wanted before he jumped toward anything new. He and Cassandra moved out of the Whitmore neighborhood into something smaller and genuinely theirs, and whatever that adjustment cost them, they were doing the work of it. I don't know what his marriage looks like on the inside. That's not mine to know. What I see is that Cassandra calls me now, occasionally, on her own. Not because Brandon is there, not as a social formality. She called once to ask me how I had handled a specific difficult thing she was going through, something involving her own family, and the conversation was real and direct and human in a way that nothing between us had been before. I think the Whitmore world had polished her into a shape that didn't entirely fit her. I think she's figuring out what does. People are complicated. That's the constant, underneath everything else. I want to tell you something now. Not as a narrator wrapping things up neatly. I don't believe in neat wrapping, and this story doesn't deserve it. But as a 63-year-old woman who has been through the specific experience of watching someone she built choose against her, and then watching the slow, painful, uneven process of them choosing back, it does not heal cleanly. I need you to hear that. There are still mornings when I think about that ballroom and feel it all over again. The warmth of the lights, the sound of Victor's assembled laughter, the single second of my son's eyes dropping to the floor rather than meeting mine. There are moments when Brandon says something, just a small thing, nothing intentional, and something in it hits the old wound and I feel it the way you feel a healed fracture in cold weather. You know it's healed, you know you're standing, and it still hurts. I don't think that goes away entirely. I think the people who tell you it does are either lucky or lying. What I will tell you is this: the hurt changed shape. It became something I carried rather than something that was carrying me. That's a real distinction, and it took real time, and it was not graceful. There were conversations with Brandon that ended badly and had to be started over. There were weeks where the distance between us felt exactly the same as it had when he was choosing Victor's world over mine, and I had to sit with that uncertainty without knowing how it would resolve. Rebuilding something broken is the most honest work there is, because it doesn't let you pretend. You can see every crack where the break was. You know exactly what failed and why, and you have to decide whether to work around the weakness or go back to the structure and make it stronger this time, knowing it might break again. I chose to go back to the structure, not because I was certain it would hold, because he's my son, and the love I have for him is not the transactional kind. It is not the kind that runs out when the return on investment falls short. I loved him when he was 4 years old eating crackers on a kitchen floor. I loved him when he was 17 and arrogant about his own potential. I loved him when he was standing in a ballroom letting his father-in-law call me raw material, and I love him now when he sits across from teenagers in scholarship interviews and makes them feel like their stories matter. But I love him differently than I used to. Not less. Differently. With clear eyes and a boundary that was not there before. With the understanding that love between a parent and an adult child is not unconditional in its form. It is unconditional in its source, but it has to be tended and respected, and it has to run in both directions. That is what I could not see for a long time. That love, real love, requires both people to show up for it. That my willingness to absorb hurt quietly was not virtue. It was a door I had left open and told him, without words, that he could walk through as many times as he needed to, and he had walked through it because I had made it easy to. Closing that door, learning to say, no, this is not okay, this is not how I will be treated, was the hardest thing I did. Harder than the legal meetings, harder than standing across from Victor in a ballroom, harder than any of the practical work, because it meant risking the thing I was most afraid to lose. It meant being willing to let the relationship break entirely rather than let it continue the way it had been. That is a terrifying thing to be willing to do, and it is also, I believe, the only thing that made a real relationship possible on the other side of it. It is November now. 2 years, almost exactly, from the night I sat at the edge of that party and decided I was done knocking on doors that only opened from one side. Ruth Ann is coming for dinner on Thursday. The soup is better than it used to be. I've been making it since March seems like forever ago, and I've learned what it needs. Brandon called this morning about the next round of scholarship applications and stayed on the phone for 40 minutes, which he never used to do. He asked at the end if I was eating properly, which made me laugh. My son, asking me the thing I used to ask him. "I'm fine," I said. "I know," he said. "I just like to ask." I let myself hold that for a moment. The ordinary sweetness of it, the smallness of it, the way it contained what I had been missing without naming it or making it large. Just, I like to ask. Just, I'm here. Just, you matter to me in the daily way, the way that doesn't require a reason. "I'm having Ruth Ann over Thursday," I said. "You could come." A pause. "Yeah?" "Yes," I said. "If you want." "I want," he said. I have a new dress now, not navy, a deep burgundy from a shop downtown, something I bought because I liked it and it was mine. The first piece of clothing I have bought for myself, not for an occasion, not because I needed something to wear to someone else's event, in longer than I can easily remember. I wore it to the Foundation's fall reception last month. Ruth Ann told me I looked like someone who knew something. I took that as a compliment, which I think was how she meant it. Lawrence Arden, the quiet man in the house near the water, watched from a distance for 40 years and made a decision. I think about him sometimes and wonder what he saw, looking in from the outside at a young woman raising a child alone on double shifts and pride and a refusal to ask for what wasn't being offered. I wonder if he saw the thing I'm only beginning to see clearly in myself. Not the sacrifice, not the hardship, but the stubbornness underneath it. The specific, durable stubbornness of a person who keeps going, not because she doesn't feel the weight, but because she has decided somewhere foundational that she is not going to be defeated by it. He left me something because of that. And I have tried, as best I can, to use it in a way that honors it, not by becoming someone unrecognizable, not by building a monument to myself, but by turning outward, by finding the teenagers who are carrying that same stubbornness and are going to need more than stubbornness alone to get where they're going. That is my legacy, if I have one. Not the money, not the parcels, not even the foundation exactly. The idea behind the foundation that the people who do things the hard way deserve someone who notices, deserve someone who says, I see what you're carrying and I believe in where you're going, and here is something to help. Someone said that to me once in a will that arrived 30 years late, and it changed everything. So here's what I want to leave you with. Not a lesson delivered from above, because I've lived too much of a real life to believe that lessons arrive clean and whole, but an observation from where I'm standing now, with my clear eyes and my burgundy dress and my soup on the stove and my son coming on Thursday. Dignity is not something that other people give you. That's the thing nobody tells you when you're young and running on love and sacrifice and the belief that if you give enough, people will treat you accordingly. Dignity is not given. It is held. It is decided internally before anyone else in the room knows a choice is being made. I held mine in a ballroom when a man called me raw material and my son looked at the floor. I held it when I walked out of a party of 30 people who had decided I was not relevant. I held it through every phone call and every short visit and every thanks for coming that should have been something more. And then I stopped just holding it quietly. I started acting from it. And that, not the inheritance, not the land trust, not any of the external things that changed, that was the turning point. If you're sitting somewhere right now feeling like I felt, like you have given everything to someone and been treated like a footnote, I want to say this directly to you. Your love is real and your sacrifice is real, and neither of those things obligates another person to treat you well. You cannot love someone into respecting you. You cannot sacrifice enough to earn what should be freely given. What you can do is decide, quietly, internally, with no announcement and no drama. Decide that you are worth more than the space at the edge of the room. Decide that love, real love, has to go in both directions, or it is not love. It is just one person bleeding while another one walks forward. Decide that, and then live from it. Imperfectly, slowly, with setbacks and hard conversations and days where you're not sure it's working. But from it, from that decision. Lawrence Arden watched a young woman do that for 40 years and thought it was worth recognizing. I don't know if anyone is watching you, But I hope you know, without needing anyone to tell you, that it is worth doing anyway. That is the whole lesson. Everything else is just the story around it.